Fighting had spread across Louisiana like the onrush of summer brush fires. Battles were waged in the sugar-rich regions of Bayou Lafourche. Donaldsonville was bombarded and burned. General Banks led campaigns into the Bayou Teche region in the heart of Acadiana, ravaging the countryside. Blood was shed from Alexandria to the mouth of the Atchafalaya. But no matter how many battles they won, the Union still could not claim victory in Louisiana, for they still could not capture the Mississippi River.
By 1863, the Confederates only had two strongholds left on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg and Port Hudson. And as long as they could control those two spots, then they controlled the mouth of the Red River, for one. And in that corridor between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, the South was still able to shift supplies and men and mail, orders. The two halves of the Confederacy were still linked as long as the South could maintain Port Hudson and Vicksburg.
Fighting raged in northeast Louisiana as the Union tried several times to open the river by taking Vicksburg, but they were driven back each time. Northern generals grew so desperate to seize the Mississippi that they even tried to change the river's course, straightening it to bypass Vicksburg altogether. Thousands of men were forced to dig miles of canals.
In doing this, they flooded northeast Louisiana. Union engineers estimated at one time that they had intentionally flooded 1,000 square miles of northeast Louisiana.
But the Mississippi stayed right where it was, firmly in Confederate hands. On May 27, 1863, General Banks ordered a full frontal assault on the rebel stronghold of Port Hudson. Among the vanguard were the 1st and 3rd Regiments of the Louisiana Native Guard, numbering more than 1,000 soldiers. 6 times they charged across open terrain through a blinding hail of enemy fire. At the front of their ranks was Captain André Caillou.
Caillou led his troops against an impregnable fortress there at Port Hudson. His name is often called up and referenced in terms of bravery of blacks, not only in the Civil War, but in other wars.
Louisiana Native Guard's assault at Port Hudson was heroic, but no more heroic than the others. The difference was it was the first time that black soldiers had been used on that scale, and it convinced Banks and began to convince other generals like Grant and Sherman that with proper training, black soldiers could be just as effective as the white soldiers.
Some called André Caillou the first black hero of the Civil War, but the battle at Port Hudson would make heroes of many men.
The heat of the day became oppressive, and it was most heartrending to hear the wounded begging to be moved into the shade, and we unable to do anything for them. Darkness finally threw a veil over the field, whereon lay hundreds of dead and dying.
Backed by Admiral Farragut's fleet of gunboats on the river, General Banks commanded a force of some 40,000 troops. The Confederates' fortress at Port Hudson was defended by less than 7,000, yet their lines held. The soldiers settled in for a long siege.
You can constantly bombard the defenders with artillery and rifle fire so that they can't rest, they can't move around during the daylight. You've got the heat, you've got insects, you've got all these factors that are just really constantly preying on the minds of these soldiers. There's no respite in siege warfare. It's constant bombardment, constant deprivation.
By the end of June, Union casualties exceeded 4,000.
Seeing the doctors with sleeves rolled up, splashed with blood, here a pile of booted legs, there a pile of arms, was more trying than the horrors of the battlefield.
The misery was so great that during lulls in fighting, the Confederate soldiers would sneak across the lines to bring canteens of water to the very men they'd been shooting.
The piteous cries of water, water, from hundreds of the enemy's wounded and the groans of the dying now touched with deepest sympathy those with whom they had but today been locked in deadly strife.
Despite Union charges and relentless pounding from Farragut's ships, the men at Port Hudson held off an army 6 times its size for 48 days, the longest siege in U.S. military history. But on July 7th, word reached them that 150 miles upriver, the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg had fallen. It was senseless to continue. Nearly starved, the rebels surrendered Port Hudson 2 days later. After trying to kill each other for 6 weeks, the soldiers now came out of their trenches, laughing and weeping. Men in both blue and gray stood together on the battlefield, shook hands, and celebrated the end of the hellish siege.
There's a very human story, particularly during the siege, of the deprivation that the soldiers on both sides faced, the hardships that they had to go through, and really what it took for these men to remain loyal to the ideals that they had joined the armies to fight for, particularly the Confederate soldiers.
1 week later, the steamer Imperial sailed down the Mississippi and docked in New Orleans.
The Father of waters again flows unvexed to the sea.